Good evening all, and welcome. Animals can make great mascots who protect you and keep you safe, maybe even detect danger. But there are other times where animals can be the danger to you, perhaps if you're in their territory a little bit too long. I also have a quick announcement. Starting today, I'm hosting a contest in my pop base. Head over to my arcade and do your best to get the highest score on Bat Eradicator. The contest will end September 24th, 4 PM Pacific time. First place winner at the end of it wins a base pass, and 9 runners-up will receive gems. So good luck. If you don't know what my pop base is, it's in the description. It's an awesome place to get new, interesting content made by me. So please check it out. It would mean a lot. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Back in the early 2000s, certain states were in mountain lion frenzy. People were claiming to see them every day. Photos were taken, but they were always obviously just large house cats. These were states that had never been home to mountain lions, or states where mountain lions once lived, but were overhunted or driven away. Supposedly, a mountain lion was spotted at the playground of a school not far from where I lived. My mum didn't really believe in it, but she told me nonetheless to be cautious. One day, me and 3 girls from my neighborhood were climbing up a hill that sat beside our neighborhood. The hill was steep, covered in overgrown weeds and woody plants, and led to a small patch of woods and train tracks that went into a closed-off concrete factory. I used to go up there a lot. The place has a lot of rumors surrounding it, and it's a pretty creepy location, but I never felt threatened. This day was different. I could feel eyes on me the entire climb up. When we reached the top, the air was eerily still. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. For some reason I kept looking at the treetops rather than the ground in front of us. The youngest girl in the group says, "What's that?" I look across the woods to see a cat. But as it started walking closer, did I realize how big it was. The other girls screamed and ran away, which was a stupid move. But my dad made me watch nature documentaries, so even at 10, I knew not to make any sudden movements. This gargantuan mountain lion gets closer and closer to me, and I stay completely still and try not to show fear. After what felt like an eternity, I was face to face, up close and personal with it. I probably shouldn't have, but I locked eyes. I would have fallen in love with its big blue eyes if I hadn't been defecating in my briefs. The mountain lion starts sniffing me. It sniffs my hand, and at one point it pushes its nose up against my palm. This makes me think that it may have been someone's pet. The fur was surprisingly soft, and its nose warm, and if I had known for sure that it had been fully domesticated, I probably would have patted its head, but I didn't. I stood completely still. I guess the mountain lion either didn't think I was very tasty, or just didn't want to get its claws dirty, because it just turned and walked away. When it was gone, I ran home and told my mum what I had seen. I didn't tell her that I had been face to face with it, because I knew she'd lose her mind and call animal control, and I really didn't want them to kill it. And I really didn't want them to get to it. That was 2002 to 2003. I don't think there has been another mountain lion scare since. Looking back, it was horrifying, but also a beautiful, once-in-a-lifetime experience. In 1986, my wife and I decided we wanted to go camping on an island. so we loaded all of our camping gear into our boat that was way too small to be on the open water, and went wandering around the coastal islands of southwest Florida. Eventually, we found a nice looking spot on a small island and set up a campsite. We walked around the island and determined that we were the only people on the whole place. After a nice evening alone on the beach, we settled into our tents and sleeping bags for the night. At about 1 a.m., we were awoken by a scream, but this was no ordinary scream. The sound was inhuman and unbelievably loud just outside the tent. I instantly had goosebumps on top of goosebumps. I really do not have words to describe the scream that awakened us. It was an absolute mind-numbing howl from the pits of hell itself. Perhaps if you were pounding Bigfoot's nuts with a sledgehammer on an anvil, he might make this sound. But it was not just a single scream. In a few seconds, the scream repeated, and something brushed up against the side of the tent, shaking it. My wife and I were terrified. Something was on the island with us, something inhuman, something big, making sounds that caused my heart to stop with each cry. A third time the cry repeated. This time we heard the distinct sound of our camping supplies being scattered and thrown around. I was terrified beyond logical thinking. I was frozen in indecision. I had to know what was out there, so that I could perhaps fight it, but I was too terrified to look out the door of the tent. My imagination was running wild with what unholy terror I would encounter upon unzipping the tent flap. My wife was terrified also, but kept pushing me to look. Finally, after the fourth scream, I could hide under the covers no longer. I slowly extracted myself from my sleeping bag. I moved to a crouched position so that I could spring into a fight quicker. With the camping knife clenched firmly in my right hand, I slowly pulled the zipper of the tent, all the time trying to stay as quiet as possible. Eventually, I nervously pull an opening high enough to place a single eye against the wall of the tent and peek out. I couldn't believe my eyes. The sound that scared us nearly out of our minds were raccoons. A whole group, a herd, a family, whatever you call a bunch of them. They were rummaging through and fighting over our dinner scraps and camping supplies. One of the larger ones had the remains of a crab, a claw firmly attached to its right front paw. And every time this one would scuffle with the other one over some of the scraps, the raccoon with the claw attached to its paw would howl like a banshee. I did not know that a raccoon could make a sound like that. It's unearthly. We spent some time watching them scuffle over our scraps before shooing them away. We later learned that although not the official name of the island we were on, the locals chose to call the island Raccoon Island. I live in rural southern Nevada, a small dust hole town on the Cali border. Anyway, I was in the middle of town by our shopping strip with some friends when we stopped at a bench to smoke a cig. Well, that's when I noticed the bird. Now there are all kinds of birds that walk, yes, walk, around the parking lot looking for food. Mostly pigeons and a few crows. This bird wasn't one of those. It was a tiny jet black bird with yellow eyes. It looked old as hell and was very scruffy, missing patches of feathers, bald neck, and just hopping along near some other birds. I pointed him out to my buddies. "Look at that ugly bird." And as soon as I said it, the bird stopped, turned around and looked at me. With my first-hand knowledge of freaky paranormal stuff out in the desert, this made me uneasy, so I continued, "Nah, he's not ugly. Looks like he's been through some stuff. Probably a badass bird." And I kid you not, the bird nodded and went back to hopping down the sidewalk. Now, I've seen this same bird twice in that part of town, always chilling in the back of whatever posse birds he's not following. Not sure if this is legit or not, but there was something different about that bird. This happened in Thailand in 2014. I had lost my job in Zurich and decided to use the opportunity to make a trip around the world, starting with Southeast Asia. I have always wanted to work with animals, so after backpacking Vietnam and parts of Thailand, I applied for a volunteer position at an ape sanctuary. They told me I could start whenever I wanted. The deal was that I had to make a deposit of around 20,000 baht, which nowadays translates to a little bit more than $500. They told me that if I stayed at least 3 months, I would get 70% of my money back. The early days of working there were wonderful. The place was full of young, motivated people who thought they could save the world one ape at a time. The majority of the animals were rescued gibbons. Our goal was to nurse them back to health and eventually release them back into the wild. Our responsibilities as volunteers were to feed them, clean their cages, and educate visiting tourists about the horrors of the illegal pet trade in Thailand. Before they came to us, most of the gibbons had been abused as tourist attractions. You know, those pictures you see on Facebook from people being on vacation somewhere in Asia, where they hold cute animals into the camera? This is how the poachers make their money. They will put a gibbon, lizard, or slow loris on your shoulder, snap a picture, and charge you for it afterwards. I can tell you that every single one of those animals had been through hell, and was destined to a short life after those pictures had been taken. The thing is, poachers can only use the babies as tourist attractions, because as soon as they reach puberty, they become territorial and aggressive, and are no longer of use to them. On average, to get a single baby, the poachers has to end the life of 15 other gibbons. This is because they are still attached to their mothers at that age, and the poachers will shoot her first. Then they will shoot the father because he will be trying to protect them. In most cases, the baby won't survive the fall from the trees, so the poacher have to end the lives of a few extra families until one survives. Then the real pain begins. They have their fangs ripped out without anesthetics so they can't bite. They will be drugged so they stay awake during the night when the tourists roam the street. They will be chained so they cannot escape. They will be kept in tiny cages, fed the wrong food, and some will be taught to drink alcohol or even smoke. And as soon as they are no longer of use, they will be left to perish. The poachers will then go on and find the next. As you can imagine, most of the gibbons in that sanctuary had been pretty traumatized, but still, working with them was fascinating. They all had their own personalities, including little quirks, preferences, and biases. Most of them were shy. Some only tolerated men near them. Some disliked girls with blonde hair. One female took a particular liking to me. Every time I walked by her cage, she would start playing with herself furiously. Her boyfriend, who was kept in the same cage, did not seem to care at all. I spent my days cutting fruit, mixing cement, hosing poop down the drain, and getting eaten alive by the mosquitoes. Even though it was hard labor without any real pay, It was probably one of the best times of my whole trip. We all felt like we were doing something selfless, something noble. It was a truly fulfilling experience. Then one day, I was scheduled to work in the quarantine area. This is the place that tourists never get to see. It's where they keep the really bad cases, the gibbons that had been damaged beyond hope. They told me some of the things that had been done to them. Unspeakable horrors. All of them were either too sick, too weak, or too aggressive to ever be released back into the wild again. To be blunt, most of them were insane. First there was Ninny. She was hyperactive and showed self-mutilating behaviors. You always had to feed her first. If she saw you give food to a different cage before hers, she would flip out, rip out her hot water container, and throw herself down to the floor and start biting at her own arms. She was also kind of mean. The other volunteers had warned me that she would try to startle me. She would hide in a dark corner of her cage or act as if she were busy or sleeping. But as soon as you turned your back to her, she would jump at the bars right behind you with this ear-piercing scream and rattle the fence. I have dropped more than one food basket in this manner, and after a few times of that happening, I got sick of it. I filled my mouth with water and walked closely by her cage, facing away, far enough that she could not reach me if she stuck her arm through the wire. As soon as I heard her move, I instantly turned around and spat the water at her. I did not hit her, as gibbons have lightning-fast reflexes, but she never tried to scare me again after that. Then there was one who literally looked and behaved like a zombie. His name was Fanta. He had been blinded by an infection in both eyes. They were white and foggy. Big chunks of his fur had fallen out, giving him a very decrepit appearance. He never swung and only moved by slowly walking along the branches of his cage. You had to rattle his food basket during feeding time so that he would know when to come out and eat. Another one was called Pam. She was special. They never told me what had happened to her, but she was missing one foot, one hand, and all but 2 fingers on her other hand. You had to cut up her food into really small pieces, because she had a hard time eating. She was already old for a gibbon, and very calm, yet there was something out of the ordinary in her eyes, something intelligent. She was the only gibbon we were allowed to touch. We had to, because we needed to apply cream and powder to her stump. She hated the powder though, and would only allow it if she got a little massage first. Like all the gibbons in this area, she was alone in her cage. I guess she just missed being groomed by a partner. A Thai worker told me the story about how some years ago, a volunteer who was going to clean her water container found it empty. That was unusual for Pam, because with only 2 fingers, she wasn't really able to drink that fast. He turned the container upside down just to be sure, when a dark green scorpion fell out and crawled away. There were a few more apes in the quarantine area whose names I've already forgotten, but there is one I'll never forget. Burro. Burro was huge for a gibbon, and strong. If he managed to get a hold of your shirt, he could pull you up to the cage and rip it right off your body in a single pull. Same thing was true for tufts of hair. While most gibbons get really excited during feeding time, Burro was different. The first time I approached his cage, he didn't even come down to see what kind of food he would be getting. I could already hear him chewing on something up in his cage. Black feathers were floating down from his branch. He had somehow managed to catch a bird, and Burro was one of the few gibbons who still had his fangs, and there was something wrong with his lungs. He was the only one you could actually hear breathing, and when he sang, which he did not do often. It had this weird rattling tone to it. Oh, and he was also infected with hepatitis. And since he liked to throw his poo around, his hands were sometimes covered in feces. You better make sure he'd not scratch you. They had tried to find a girlfriend for him a few times, but it never worked out. It seemed like he just hated other gibbons, and for some reason, he really hated me. They had told me that Borrow was not fond of new volunteers, but with me, it was on a different level. For example, we used a water hose to clean the cages from feces. The water pressure had to be quite high because after some time in the sun, the poo would become dry and really stick to the bars of the cage. Gibbons don't like to get wet. That's why most of them hide in one of the top corners while we did the cleaning. During those few minutes, I felt like I was in charge. I did not have to constantly cover my back. One mistake did not mean a new scratch or a urine stain, but to Borrow, the hose meant nothing. Whenever I came close to his cage, he instantly tried to rip it from my hand. He didn't even care if he got soaked. He just cared about catching me or taking something away from me. Whenever I worked in quarantine, I could feel his stare. Whatever I did, he was watching me. Every single time I came close, he tried to grab me. He would hide in the shadows of his little house or behind some branches, then jump at the fence and reach through it. His claws were always exactly at face level, sometimes just a few inches away, grasping desperately. The tie keepers told me they had never seen behavior like that. One day, a huge spider web had appeared overnight between a tree and the next cage over, blocking my usual path. I'm not a fan of spiders, and I was behind schedule, so instead of removing it, I tried to go around it. It meant I had to be a little closer to Borrow's cage than usual. I thought it was still far enough, but it wasn't. I tried to squeeze past the tree with my back to his cage. He caught the collar of my shirt. I was lucky that I was already holding onto the tree, otherwise he would have pulled me to the cage. I heard him hiss behind me as I managed to pull away, my shirt tearing, and me falling face first into the web. I took a little walk afterwards to calm myself down. When I returned, he was sitting in the shadows of his house again, breathing this slow, rattling breath. That was the last night I ever saw him. The next thing I am about to tell you, I did not see with my own eyes, but the keepers told us a few days later at lunch. That morning, when the keepers and some volunteers arrived at the quarantine, they felt like there was something wrong. Gibbons usually sing, especially in the early hours of the day. You can hear them from miles away if they give it their all. But this morning it was quiet. The first thing they noticed when they entered the area was a huge red puddle under Fanta's cage. What was left of him was hanging in the feeding area. They found parts of him in his food basket outside his cage and on the ground. The second thing they noticed was that Borrow's cage was empty. What had happened was that the part where his little house was screwed to the back of the cage had rusted, and combining its weight with his strength, he managed to rip it out and squeeze himself through the hole it left. Fortunately, none of the other gibbons were hurt. It was partly my fault that he had escaped. The volunteers were supposed to check the integrity of the cages at least once a week. The tool we used for that was a long stick with a metal hook on top. It should have been used to pull at the rusty part of the grid to see if it would still hold. But that type of work was a pain. The tool was heavy, and the gibbons would always go crazy and grab it. You had to go places in the area that were hard to reach, so almost nobody cared to do it properly. The team they had to catch gibbons was one guy with a blow tube. He was actually a great guy. He taught us how to cook rice in bamboo and could climb a tree in seconds, but he was also an alcoholic. Almost every night, he would down a bottle of sang som and then try to find a way into the women's bungalow. Nobody really had any hopes of catching Burrow again, unless he would return to his cage by himself, which some gibbons before him actually did. From the moment they told me that Burrow had escaped, working in this sanctuary became quite stressful for me. I always imagined him watching me from the trees outside. They went looking for him in the forest, but there was no trace. Not even once we heard him singing in the distance. Still, every time a branch snapped somewhere behind the trees, I twitched. During the next week, we heard that some tourists had been attacked by a wild gibbon. They went out into the forest and looked for the culprit, but nothing came of it. The following night, I was awakened by a familiar sound. At first, I thought it was my roommate snoring. Then I realized it came from the window, which had no glass, only a mosquito net. A slow, rattling breath. It was Burrow. It was pitch black, but I'm sure it was him. He was holding his breath every couple of seconds, as if he wanted to be quiet so he could listen for something. I just lay there trying not to make any sounds. I thought about what I was going to do if he decided to come inside. My plan was to use my blanket to shield my body. My roommate would surely help me. After a few more moments, the rattling breath stopped one more time. It never resumed, and he was gone. The next day I told our boss that I was leaving. It was not only because of Burrow. Some of the other people that I really liked were leaving too, and I just felt like my time there was over. There were many more places in the world I wanted to see, and I'm sure they were able to afford a few new cages with the money I left them. So I did not feel bad about my decision. I don't know if Burrow ever returned to the sanctuary. When I think about it now, I just feel sorry for him. He was not evil, just a wild animal that had experienced more terrors than most of us can ever imagine. Me and about 3 of my friends recently went to a fishing hole we discovered on a private gated golf course. To get to the water, you had to park about 1/4 of a mile away from the spot in the maintenance section parking lot and walk in this pitch black dirt path. The parking lot itself is poorly lit by 2 dim streetlights, and visibility is almost non-existent. It's close to the main road, and we all planned to go one night. Then I misjudged how fast I could get there, and arrived 10 minutes before anyone else. I pulled into the lot behind the dumpster and got my backpack on and grabbed my rod out of my trunk. I had never gone alone, and there is a lot of wildlife in the area, so I was already pretty cautious. I was prepping to walk the path when I heard lip smacking somewhat loudly, like human lip smacking. I froze in absolute terror, as I imagined the worst. The noise stopped periodically, and the smacking would resume again after a few seconds. I yelled out to whatever was there, not really worried about the golf course greenkeeper finding me and getting me in trouble. I heard what sounded like someone banging on the dumpster really loud, and the smacking stopped. I began to walk the path, and about halfway through it started again. I quickened my pace and ignored the sound. I didn't have a flashlight with me, but my friends did, and they showed up at the spot. They told me that they had heard the same sound. They lit up the path with their lights and saw a pair of coyotes, one of which was missing part of its jaw. Looking back, it was terrifying to hear that I was being followed by coyotes, but I'm sure if I were better at explaining this, it would come across as more scary. Another short moment of horror was when we were fishing in this same spot on a separate occasion. There's a heavily wooded area near the pond, and it's important to know that this spot is in Southern California, We were fishing in the dead of night and heard what sounded like banshee screams from Mass Effect. 2 of us had knives, so we weren't particularly worried about it, but it did give us the willies. Apparently there are mountain lions in those woods who travel between the nearby lake, nature preserve and golf course. I wonder how many other times we've been stalked by dangerous animals. What really made us book it though, was when the security rolled out of golf carts to investigate the noise. In July 2003, my friend John and I went on an overnight trip to Stroy Park, a flowery alpine area on the northwest flank of Mount Rainier. We went for the wildflowers, the glaciers, and the beautiful landscape. Little did I know it would bring me face to face with mortal danger. The hike was wonderful. Clear skies and pleasant temperatures made the strenuous ascent a little easier. We passed up through the tree line, past waterfalls and alpine glory. Eventually, we broke through the trees and found ourselves on the glaciated flanks of Mount Rainier. We were lucky to find a perfect campsite adjoining the glacier. We had a clear, flat area and access to water. We spent the evening shooting photos, playing songs on our kalimbas, and watching the golden hour of sunset pass over the top of the world. The night went by without incident, but John was taken ill. He caught some kind of nasty cold. The next morning, he put down some coffee and biscuits, but informed me had no energy to continue up the mountain. The exact elevation at that point is 8,364 feet, and I thought it would be a really cool idea to climb up there and see if my fancy new altimeter wristwatch was really accurate. I would have to do it alone. My plan was to head straight out of the camp, then hug the glaciated area along the base of Echo Rock. I would then follow the gently rising slope in the upper center to reach Observation Rock. I wanted to hug Echo Rock because the ascent was easier and the shadowed area had firmer snow on it, so up I went. Once I got to the shadowed area at the base of Echo Rock, they appeared. A herd of mountain goats appeared over the scree above Observation Rock and headed right towards me. They were marching straight to me. Like most city folk, I wasn't sure what the protocol was for dealing with mountain goats in the wild. Do you run? Do you puff out your chest and make noise? Do you climb a tree? I had no idea, so I just kept my mouth shut and hoped they walked past me. They did not. They crossed the glacier and moved just above me. The alpha goat was regarding me with disdain. It was at this point things got really weird. The alpha goat bellowed to his flock, "Follow me. We will destroy the intruder." Of course, this was all in goat. And so began the onslaught. This enormous beast sidled past me and climbed up the scree above me on Echo Rock. At first I thought they would simply climb up and away from me, but I was wrong. Once the entire herd had mounted the scree, they started kicking rocks down onto me. I had to sidestep to duck and leap like running back. Huge rocks bounced up all around me, many nearly clipping my head. I had nowhere to run. I backed off, but that's where the rocks seemed to be landing. If I stayed forwards, they mostly bounced over my head, and besides, I was afraid the whole herd would rush me if I ran. Most of the goats, about 15 of them, were kicking rocks down at me, but the baby mountain goat refused to engage in the cruelty. I continually moved below the baby goat because it was the safest place to be. Then one of the goats ambled over to the baby and started headbutting it and bleating loudly at it. He was saying, "Kick rocks at the human, or consequences. They will be severe." To my horror, the baby goat complied and kicked a few small rocks at me. The rotten turncoat. The cavalcade of scree started to slow down. I had evaded their reign of terror. The goats now knew I was made of sterner stuff than they had expected. As the rock attack abated, I got off one more angry goat photo and began to back away slowly. To my relief, the herd dismounted the scree just above me and started back up the glacier, curving out around Echo Rock. I took some very long breaths that morning as the goats gave up and headed back up the glacier. I didn't know it, but far below, my friend John was watching the whole thing from his telescope lens. He was prepared to mount up and haul me off if I had gotten beamed by a big rock. I was in good shape back in '03, and my 20-mile-a-week jogging habit had served me well. The 5 aspects of fitness: strength, endurance, speed, balance, and flexibility. You need all 5 in times like these. After they were gone, they of course went in search for a weaker human, and I took a few minutes to collect myself. I was uninjured, but I was still a bit shaky. I sat down on a rock and looked across the glacier. Just ahead was Observation Rock. The whole point was to climb up the rock, and I wasn't about to turn around now. I decided to get my act together and scamper up. The hike across the glacier and then up the rock was uneventful, but once I reached the top, I found I was not alone. Fergal and Tim, who were touring the North Cascades, had been up there for quite some time. They offered me hot tea and snacks, which I greedily consumed. I didn't mention anything about the recent incident. Instead, I mentioned my cool new altimeter watch. I needed to see the plaque and see if the numbers matched. We jumped over to the plaque, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that my watch was only off by about 10 feet. My sea level calibrations had proved accurate. We all sat down and quietly enjoyed the day when Fergal finally mentioned, with typical Irish understatement, "Bit of goat trouble back there, eh?" "Yeah," I smiled. Then we all broke up laughing. They had watched the whole thing from Observation Rock. Apparently, I looked like a real fool jumping and ducking and sidestepping the goat rock attack. Yeah, laugh it up. It's different when it's your ass on the line against enraged baby goats. The boys and I loaded up. They were heading around the west of the mountain, and I was heading down. They took a picture of me, and we parted ways. John was glad to see me back at camp. I told him everything that happened, and I think he found the whole thing adventurous, and he was sorry that he couldn't be there. But I put his mind at ease and assured him it was much uncooler than it looked and sounded. We broke camp and headed back down to civilization. In the end, adventure can be sought, but sometimes it can be thrust upon you. Be ready. I was standing in front of my house with my dad on a spring day. This is when I was 7. We were looking across the street at the neighbor's house, making casual conversation to pass the time. Suddenly, we see about 3 crows start to circle around the house. Then one of the crows dives into our neighbor's backyard and starts to pull apart their storm drain, the water spout that catches roof water and sends it to the ground. It appeared that the family of finches had built a nest in the drain, and the crows wanted to eat the eggs. They succeeded, but that was not all. The crows then caught one of the finches, ripped its head off and started to eat it. The other finch darted off in a fright, abandoning its home. About 3 minutes later, I kid you not, the finch returns with about 50 other finches, and they start to attack the crows. The crows took down a few more finches, but they were covered in a massive swarm of angry feathers. 2 of the crows were ripped to shreds within minutes, and the other one got away, but fell to the ground after making it to a nearby hill, probably due to a damaged wing. It was very scary for my young mind, and I had just seen the horror movie, The Birds. After everything was done, my dad turns to me and says, "What the hell?" I went camping with 4 friends a few years ago, and we were indulging one of our friends who was an avid bird watcher. So we were in an isolated valley just past the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, so he could find this owl. We were camping in a town that had a really interesting history. It used to be a booming coal mining town, but has since receded hugely, and is now only as a double-digit population. There is a huge amount of rusty mining equipment everywhere. It's a really cool place. We explored the bush around our campsite a bit, and saw some creepy-looking abandoned caravans, and decided not to get any closer. Anyway, we were going out driving at night looking for this owl. We see nothing, and go back to chat around the campfire. As we're doing this, we all kind of go quiet at the same time, and we hear what sounds like the distant screams of a teenage girl. Now we've literally seen no people in the town at this point. We don't know where the closest payphone is, and we have no reception. We all kind of look awkwardly at each other and then try to play it off, hoping that we weren't the only ones to hear it. Then it happens again, but louder, and again, and again. Now there's no denying it. There are screams coming from the bush, roughly from where the caravans were. We don't know what to do. We don't want to venture into the bush at night and possibly get lost, or worse. We don't have a phone to call anybody, and we haven't seen anybody to tell. So what do? We go into our tents, clutch our knives and try and sleep. When we wake up, Mr. Birdman informs us he did some reading in his bird Bible, and apparently the owl that he was there to see has a mating call that is described as a blood-curdling scream. It was the owl. We don't know for sure if that's what we heard, but I really hope we just heard an owl, and nothing more sinister. We have a family pup. His name is Houndoom. He's over 1.5 years old. He's a Doberman. He's the sweetest and most playful little guy you'll ever know. He loves people young and old, and is a great guard dog. His bed is in the kitchen next to the window, and we have a baby gate up to make sure he stays there when guests come in. He always barks when he sees strangers, but once we let him know they're family or friends, he turns into a big baby. Now that I've let you know about my dog, onto the story. I have an 8-year-old daughter called Maddie. She's your average 8-year-old kid. Really nice, loves stuffed animals, never seen a scary movie before, totally innocent. Her best friend is called Sarah. They're the same age and go to the same school. Her parents reached out to us on setting up play dates so they can hang out outside of learning time, and we're cool with it. Sarah has been to our house a few times. The first time she came over, Houndoom went ballistic. Now, like I said earlier, when it comes to strangers, he's barking like crazy. That is until we let him know they're good people. Well, whenever she came inside, he almost broke down the gate. I've never seen him this out of control before. My husband and I were trying to calm him down, and Sarah just stood there staring at him. She had a little smirk on her face. After trying to get Houndoom to relax, I gave up and told the girls to go upstairs. It was weird, but I brushed it off. He probably smelled other dog on her or something, I thought. The next few times Sarah came over to play with Maddie, it looked like he wanted to attack her. That thing that freaked me out happened Sunday. Sarah and her mum walked up to the house and my dog immediately went crazy. He even started growling, which only happens when he encounters other animals. Her mum didn't talk much, which I thought was weird, but I tried not to dwell on it. This time, I wanted Sarah to pet him. I know I'm crazy. I just figured he needed to get close enough to smell her and perhaps he'd calm down. I asked Sarah to come close, and she was looking at him in a very weird way, almost like she was teasing him. She wasn't afraid either, kind of like she knew why he was so livid. She brought her hand closer to him, and as we were petting him and calming him down, he growled and tried to bite her. He didn't because I moved her hand out the way, and after that resumed the barking like he wanted to rough her up. I told them to go back upstairs, and I turned to my husband like, does that not strike you as odd? The way my dog looked at her and barked at her made me feel so ugly. It's like he sensed something from her. My dog is normal, and he'd never acted that way before. He's perfectly fine with other strangers we introduce him to though. I haven't been able to sleep that great, because I keep thinking about how creeped out I feel around Sarah. I highly doubt I'll ever let her come over again. This is probably one of the most nerve-wracking things I've ever experienced while camping. It happened to me while I was in the Boy Scouts. My troop had hiked for an entire day into the mountains, following an incredibly old and vague hunting trail. After at least 6 hours of hiking, we finally get close to our spot, which to be fair was an incredibly beautiful valley tucked in the Rockies with a gentle crystal clear river, maybe 1/4 of a mile wide but only a few inches deep. But about a mile before we reaching the stopping point, we started seeing skulls. To be fair, they were all deer or elk, but still, seeing at least 24 skulls scattered around the area, some strung up in trees in various states of decomposition, is not a pretty picture. So as nervous as the other scouts and I and a few other of the adults were, we forged on, collected a few racks of antlers and made it to the camp. After making camp, setting up and cooking dinner, we all had pretty much forgotten about the skulls. So it starts getting dark, we clean up for the night and get into our tents, and eventually everyone falls asleep, except for me. I've always suffered from insomnia, so I usually stay up late and read, especially whilst camping, so I was the first to hear the screaming. It was a bone-chilling scream, the likes of which I've never heard before or since. I knew to the depths of my soul it was a mountain lion, and not only had we probably camped right on his feeding grounds, but it also saw our camp and wasn't pleased. Can't get any worse, right? Wrong. By this time everyone had woken up, and all the scoutmasters yelled at us to stay in our tents, when all of a sudden we heard another one start screaming as well, also on the other side of the river. There's nothing as terrifying as hearing that screaming, knowing how close these extremely dangerous and most likely angry predators were, but not being able to see them for whatever reason. They never crossed the river, but they kept on screaming off and on until dawn. After getting out of our tents and having a quick breakfast, we packed up in record time and left. I still have the antlers I grabbed as we marched sitting on my dresser at home. I was outside checking on some turtles that were hibernating a few miles into the woods. As I'm finishing checking on the last turtle, I hear this growl and the entire woods goes quiet. I stand there for a second listening, and I can hear something moving through the woods behind me to my left. I get up, grab my walking stick, and pull out my knife and begin walking slowly to my truck. As I walk, I can hear it walking behind me slowly, working its way kind of to my side, where I can see that it's a huge wild dog. I get within about 100 feet of my truck, when I hear it starting to run through the leaves. I turned around screaming as loudly as I could, swinging my walking stick, and it runs in the other direction but stops and watches me a few yards away. I keep walking to my car and it keeps following me right as I get close to my truck. I hit the alarm button on the keys and the wild dog runs off and I run to my car. While I drove out, I could see the dog in my rearview mirror following me, so I hit the gas to get out of there. I went camping with a friend of mine one 4th of July weekend. We were just friends, as she had a boyfriend, so she slept in her car with her dog, as she wasn't a huge fan of sleeping in tents, and I slept in the tent. My night goes fine. I sleep pretty well. The front of my tent was facing her car, and the rear of my tent was facing the woods. In the morning, as the sun was rising, I hear footsteps out the back side of my tent and feel and hear fur rubbing up against it. It's amazing how much you can hear in the middle of the woods, away from roads and cities. Unfortunately, the back of my tent was facing west, so there were no shadows. I figured, oh, she probably let her dog out and he wants in. So I opened the front of my tent towards her car, and my stomach dropped. In her car, I see her dog, a black Labrador, staring outside the window with paws on the dashboard growling, with his hair standing on end. So many things ran through my mind at once. Oh man, what the hell was behind me? I don't want to get eaten. So I just sat there staring at the dog, who was staring at whatever is behind me. It was one of those moments where everything goes silent and all you hear is your heartbeat. You feel it in your hands and you strain your ears to try and hear what you think is going to eat you. Eventually I built up the courage to clear my throat loudly, and I think whatever it was fled. I never knew what it was, but it scared the hell out of me. A few minutes later, my friend let the dog out of the car, and I grabbed it so it didn't chase whatever was behind me. The dog just wanted a cuddle anyway. I did have my firearm and bear spray, but it's not like I was going to leave my tent to apply it to whatever massive animal was behind it. And no, there was no food inside the tent, as we had sensibly left it in the cars. I worked as a forest fire ranger for 3 years while in college. We often spent up to 20 days in the bush, moving campsites as we worked along the fire's edge. One night, I got up to urinate with a lantern. I could hear some branches and movement at the edge of our camp. Wild animals never really bothered me over the years. We had many encounters with bears, specifically that would try to get to our food. Me not thinking too much, I made a little yip to see if I could stir something into running off. I used the lantern and could see the reflection of 2 sets of eyes in the light bulbs, but not much else in the outline of the woods. They were spaced about 20 feet from each other. I turned into camp pretty damn quick and got the chainsaw we used for cutting trees and making camps. I ripped it wide open and scared those buggers off. It was a pack of wolves, and they had been curious enough to inspect our camp. I fully understand that the wolves would not have likely have ever thought about attacking our camp, especially with 4 adults there, but there was something incredibly unsettling about the way they stalked and sat there when caught. It was definitely the most unsettling experience that I have ever had in the woods. Growing up, my family, mother, father, half-sister and I, lived in a run-down, low-income neighborhood in my small hometown. Our street was small. As you drive down the neighborhood, there was an apartment building to your right, then 2 houses on the left, one of which we lived in, and the forest began at the end of the stretch. It seemed like all the people who lived on our street had some kind of substance abuse or domestic violence issue going on. Anywho, I was around 5. I'm female, and my sister was around 8. We had a big black Labrador / Newfoundland mix, Riley, who was a huge, sweet goober. Let us paint his toenails, tie up his hair in a ponytail, and was always very tolerant of us kids and as affectionate as could be. He loved all of our family and friends, and he was always friendly and happily curious of strangers. So, one day, a new neighbor we had called Pete was on our lawn speaking to my dad. He had just moved into the apartment, and he was on the top floor. He had apparently gone to grade school with my dad, and they were catching up. I remember playing with my sister in the backyard, and my mum came out to tell us, "Daddy wants you to meet a friend." So with Riley trailing behind, we walked through our house to the front door, and stood in the front doorway blocking Riley from getting there, as he had a habit of escaping to get lost and play in the woods. Pete was very pale, a little overweight, and had insanely light blue eyes with heavy eye bags. He wore a flannel and skull cap daily. Just some really strange looking guy, but was not that out of the ordinary for our neighborhood at all. As my dad was introducing us to Pete, we heard Riley growling behind us. Riley had never growled at anyone before. He'd only ever growled at raccoons in the backyard. So it was really weird. Next, I remember he pushed his way past us. Riley, the huge sweetie who'd never bit any of us, even accidentally during play, lunged at Pete. My dad caught him by the collar before he got there. He chalked it up to Riley having stranger danger, even if that's nothing that we'd seen him do in the past. Riley continued to growl and glare at Pete for the rest of their conversation, which was cut short by Riley lunging again. Pete then told my parents that they should have him checked for rabies. Yeah. Once Pete moved in, when Riley was outside, he would get intermittently barked and snarled at, something he had never done before or after Pete. Riley did this until we finally moved. So anyway, during that conversation on the lawn, my dad learned that Pete had a daughter who he shared custody with the mother, yet we only saw her sparingly, as she was dropped off and picked up. She was in our age group, but she never played with us or the rest of the kids in our neighborhood. Ever. We never saw her in school, as I imagine she went to the elementary school the next town over, because her mum apparently lived there. So we never interacted with her at all. It was just really strange vibes. We hypothesized about why she was seemingly not allowed to play with us for years, until we realized that we hadn't seen her in a long time, so she obviously wasn't having visits with Pete anymore. So around 8 years after this incident on the lawn, I was 13ish. My parents had split up, my father retained custody of my sister, and my mum and I moved to a neighboring town within the county. Through the grapevine, my mum had learned something that explained Riley's behavior towards Pete, and she explained that she wanted to tell me about it before I heard this anywhere else. It was always a thing within our family that Riley freaked out like that because it was too out of character for him, and my mum always had weird vibes from Pete anyway. Pete had been sexually assaulting his daughter. He was also physically abusing her, keeping her confined to her bedroom and not allowing her to leave the apartment even to accompany him somewhere. 8 years after Pete had moved in, his daughter had finally found the courage to open up about this after years of abuse. Apparently before, when we had noticed we hadn't seen her come and go in weeks, she had told her mum that he was only physically abusive, and thus they stopped splitting custody, and he wasn't allowed to see her anymore after a brief stint in jail. He scared her into silence. This story was later backed up by a cop friend of my mum's confirming it. So Riley's instincts were spot on. He lived to be 13 and continued to be loyal, sweet, big old baby that he was. He never encountered anyone else who provoked a growl or lunge from him ever again in his life. He really was a good boy. I had been visiting my high school sweetheart's family in town, as I live out in said countryside. Her sister and aunt had been very vividly describing the myth of the Lechuza, a human-sized owl spirit, and their related scary stories of the times spent in rural South Texas. It had been a great night, entertaining a romantic skeptic like me on some good old-fashioned spooksies. I kissed my girlfriend goodnight and began driving the 10 miles home in my dad's handy Jeep. Midway, I notice a full moon, just like in the stories. Spooky. I exit the interstate and immediately enter the watch for deer territory as I trek the last couple of miles home. I got to the base of the hill which hides my house from view, with half a mile to go, and then I'm practically home. And bam, there's an owl standing in the middle of the road blocking my lane. In all of my 17 years of living out there, I had never seen an owl, only heard them. The Lechuza might as well have been standing in front of me. Not human, but large. I had to literally slow down to a mere 5 miles per hour before I was allowed to pass, almost as if to say, yes, this was meant for you to see. And I went home, told my mum, messaged my girlfriend, and thought about it all night long. Probably missed my Hogwarts invite. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. We had some powerful stories today, and I do hope that you enjoyed them. If you did, be sure to let me know in the comments section, and by leaving a big like, that's pretty nice. So like I said at the start, if you're interested in getting the high score in Battle Eradicator on my pop base, you're going to have lots of fun and you can win some pretty awesome stuff. There's also the fact that pop base is pretty awesome even if you don't want to play the game, so please check it out. I put so much work into it and it would really be awesome if you guys would see what I've done and see the content I've created and let me know what you think, and I do hope that you like it. But anyway, I'd like to give a huge thank you as always to all my amazing patrons. The names can be seen on screen, and if you'd like your name on screen and want to know how to become a patron, you can find that info in the description too. It is incredibly and greatly appreciated. If there's a story that you would like to share, send it to my email, drop it to my Reddit, and be generous with your paragraphing, punctuation, and description, as that really helps me select your story if I'm going to read it. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.